Good morning and welcome to Unlocking Lockdown. My name is Sophia James. I'm the Head of Student Recruitment and Outreach at Buckinghamshire University. We are so excited to have so many of you in attendance. I'm here to do a little bit of housekeeping for the day. Today is organised in 2 sessions, and on this first session you will have access to our first 2 keynote speakers of the day. When a session ends, please return to the Study Hire Virtual Conference 2020 page to choose your next session. You won't be able to use your microphones or turn your cameras on, but you can ask questions on the Q&A function. We will try and field as many questions as we can to our speakers throughout the day, so please do get involved and add to the debates. All sessions will be recorded and available on our main page after the event. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to our welcome team, introducing Professor Nick Braisby, Vice-Chancellor, and Professor Gavin Brooks, Provost and Deputy Vice-Chancellor at Buckinghamshire University, who will formally open our event.
Sorry, Nick, you're still muted.
Thank you very much, Sophia, and a very warm welcome indeed to this Study Hire conference hosted by Buckinghamshire University. Bucks has a long and proud heritage of widening participation. We're a diverse institution with among the sector's highest proportions of Black students, of Asian students, and of mature students. And we work really hard to ensure all our students succeed. We're proud to boast one of the sector's best employment rates and one of the sector's lowest BAME attainment gaps, though of course we still have more to do. We also work hard to open the doors of higher education to those who otherwise might be denied the opportunity. And in this regard, I want to mention the vital work Bucks is doing to support the Gypsy, Traveller and Roma communities, ensuring these, the most disadvantaged groups in our country, enjoy better access to and support in higher education. Working with the communities and the sector, we are developing a pledge for higher education institutions to commit to implementing changes which we believe will lift the educational outcomes for the Gypsy, Traveller and Roma communities. So for these and many other reasons, we are truly delighted to be hosting this Study Hire conference, and I sincerely wish you a very rewarding and enjoyable day. And now to introduce the conference, I'd like to welcome the Provost and Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the University and Chair of the Study Hire Board, Professor Gavin Brooks.
Thank you, Nick, and good morning, everyone. As Provost and Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Buckinghamshire University and also as Chair of the Study Hire Board, I'm delighted to welcome you to the 3rd Study Hire Annual Conference that this year is being hosted by Bucks University. For those of you who might not be aware, Study Hire was established 9 years ago, back in 2011, and it now comprises a total of 4 core universities, those being Bucks New, Oxford Brookes, and the University of Reading, and 11 other partner colleges and organisations, all of which work together in partnership to provide young people with high quality, impartial advice and guidance about education opportunities. In 2017, Study Hire was fortunate enough to win funding from the then National Collaborative Outreach Programme, which is now called UniConnect, to enable it to continue and develop its great work. And today we're going to hear more about some of that great work that's been supported by Study Hire and by UniConnect. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers for you today, and I'm delighted that we have more than 400 delegates who've registered for the event. And these represent colleagues from our partner institutions, as well as from other institutions and organisations across the UK, and indeed some delegates from outside the UK. So a big welcome to everyone who's joined us this morning. In this first session, we're fortunate to have 2 high-profile keynote speakers. And the first of those, I'm pleased to introduce, is Chris Millwood. And Chris is the first Director for Fair Access and Participation in the Office for Students. His role there is to ensure that universities and colleges are doing all that they can to support underrepresented groups to access and succeed in higher education. Chris is also an executive member of the OFS board, and in his previous role as HEFCE as Director for Policy, he was key in developing a number of initiatives, including the Teaching Excellence Framework, the National Student Survey, and the National Collaborative Outreach Programme. I've known Chris for many years, and I'm extremely grateful to him for agreeing to be the opening speaker at each of the Study Hire conferences we've run so far, including today. So Chris, over to you to speak to us today about OFS expectations for the year ahead. Chris.
Okay, thanks, Gavin, and thanks Nick and colleagues at Study Hire for inviting me to speak today. As Gavin said, this is the third year running I've spoken at the Study Hire conference, and I did this morning feel this great sense of nostalgia for train journeys across the Chilterns and being able to speak like this and actually see how people are reacting to what you're saying, being able to see people when they ask questions. And above all, I really hope that this time next year we'll be able to do this again, do it in that format, and that you all have a good and safe and prosperous year in between. I'm going to reflect on what's happened since last year, but also what I see coming during the next year. And I'm particularly going to talk about UniConnect, given Study Hire is hosting the conference, and a lot of you will be working with and for partnerships. But let me start by saying two really important things which are very relevant to your work. So firstly, we've seen this summer that higher education is central to the ambitions and expectations of families throughout the country. That's clear from the intensity of focus on admissions decisions since August. It's clear on the specific focus there was there on fairness and equal opportunities for the least advantaged students. And of course, that's really what you're all working on and what you're passionate about. It's also clear that the pandemic has hit the most disadvantaged people and communities across the country hardest. And that may well be the case if there's further closures of institutions, further restrictions. So it's all the more important that we focus on access and participation within our strategies and our work, and we get all of the work that you're focused on back on track as much as we can during the coming year. OFS has been monitoring quite carefully the impact of the pandemic on your work and on learning and teaching more broadly, and on specific groups of students from school right through university and beyond into work. We held roundtables with sector and student representatives and third sector representatives over the summer. We did some polling of students over the summer, and we want all of that evidence and the kind of things you will raise with me today to influence our approach to funding and to regulation during the coming year. So I'm just going to reflect quickly on what we've learnt from that during the last few months. So firstly, as you well know, this year's cohort of university applicants has faced more disruption than any in our lifetimes. They've been unable to see through the last months of learning and leaving celebrations. They've experienced 2 sets of grades following assessment changes in August, and of course a protracted admissions cycle as a result of these changes. If you've seen the UCAS data, which they published yesterday, that looks positive, really importantly. So UK acceptances up by around 11,000 or 3% on last year, particularly high growth among the lowest participation groups. I think quintile 1 up 7%, quintile 1 and 2 up 20% in high tariff providers, mature students increasing for the first time for around 5 years, and nursing a key element of that. So we're seeing record levels in many ways, or particularly high levels of higher education participation, particularly among the groups we're all working to support, and in providers that you might say, universities that you might say have the furthest to travel on fair access, and in subjects that you might say are particularly important to our health and prosperity. And that's been made possible by rapid work, rapid decision making in universities and colleges, important government decisions to remove student number controls and increase funding, and also in health and medicine to secure increased placement capacity. But we can't let that hide the major challenges that remain for our work. So, of course, people like Nick and Gavin and many of you will be focused at the moment on the academic and the practical challenges of supporting transition for students who are entering higher education following a period without learning, and of course doing that with rules that are changing around social distancing. And then there is the longer term impact we're seeing on educational inequality. So we know that the EPI, for example, had already started to indicate that the attainment gap was, or reducing the attainment gap was stalling before the pandemic. And we know that EEF's rapid evidence collection suggests that lockdown is likely to take us back to the position potentially at the start of the decade. As many people have observed, grading individuals on the basis of schools' previous grades, the initial approach to school assessment essentially shone a light on the levels of educational inequality between schools and across the country within our system. And indeed, some of the elements of the initial grading, for example, in relation to small centres, actually just compounded existing levels of educational disadvantage. So whilst we've taken great steps, really important steps, and we need to give great credit to the people involved in that during the last few weeks, there are big issues for the future, and I'm interested in how that could lead to more profound changes into the future. If we focus a bit more on what we're hearing from universities, it's clear that greater vulnerability to coronavirus has limited the ability of students at all levels, from the poorest and most disadvantaged groups, to engage with their learning. We've heard that universities and outreach partnerships have been able to maintain relationships with students they're working with in schools and in colleges, but they are concerned about fostering relationships with new cohorts in the autumn, given the wider pressures on schools this term. We are hearing that the pivot to online delivery has enabled some activities to become more accessible, meeting the needs of students, such as those with disabilities that they've called for some time. But there are, of course, real concerns also about access to IT equipment and connectivity, and indeed particularly space to study in. We have published a definition of digital poverty as part of Michael Barber's review of digital learning and teaching. A lot of this is focused on students who are already in higher education, but I think it's also very relevant to your work, so we would really welcome your input and evidence that you have by the deadline for mid-October for that. We want to know if you agree with the definition and what should be done about it. We've said that students in digital poverty, if they're without access to one of the core items of digital infrastructure, which are appropriate hardware, appropriate software, reliable access to the internet, technical support and repair when required, a trained teacher or instructor, and appropriate study space. So we're really interested in that definition, and also how you think we should respond to that definition, how it should play into future regulation and funding. We wrote to universities and colleges in July, setting out how we would use insights like this to inform future setting of regulatory requirements, not just for A&P, but also for quality. We're planning now to issue guidance in November, which will set out how universities and colleges should report in the spring on the activity and the financial support they delivered to students during the last year. But it will also give universities and colleges a chance to indicate what impact they think the pandemic may have on their future plans. And of course, for most people, these are up to 5-year plans. We'll use that evidence to determine whether universities and colleges made reasonable judgments in how they used money during this period and the decisions they made during that period, but also to agree any changes that may need to be made to the forward plan. That could be because activity you'd planned couldn't be delivered. It could be because the grading system this year has led to a different intake than anticipated, or indeed there are just new imperatives arising from the pandemic. For example, more students becoming eligible for financial support, the need to secure digital resources for students, or indeed increased demand from cohorts of students you may not have been focused on. Mature students would be a good example of that, given the jobs market. Those reports will also be the place in which we collect reports we may have been requiring from universities and colleges through enhanced monitoring on particular issues that were crucial to the first year of their plan. I'm going to, in the second half of this, I'm just going to focus on UniConnect in particular, both what we've done and what we've expected from partnerships and what will happen into the future. So a key priority for us since March has been to keep funding flowing. So we did write in March to confirm that funding would continue in 1920 and indeed in 2021. We did say, given what was happening in schools, the closure of schools, that we wouldn't hold partnerships to account for engagement targets, but we did make clear we wanted kind of something in return. So we wanted partnerships to deploy alternative delivery models. We thought there was scope to support a wider range of underrepresented students, not just those in target schools and wards, given the modes that were being used. We also asked partnerships to focus particularly on students applying this year, given the disruption to their plans. And we set continued expectations for evaluation. And a key issue there is we needed and we wanted to learn rapidly from the different modes that you were putting into place. We've tried to support that by publishing digital resources that people were using, so there could be sharing on that, also facilitating discussions between partnerships on issues they were finding particularly challenging. When we wrote in August, we set out expectations for the coming year, and that acknowledged that, again, given the closure of schools, it may be challenging to achieve the established engagement targets, but again, we would be looking for something alongside that if that wasn't possible to be achieved. So we've maintained the engagement measure for the programme as a whole, and we've asked you to keep working towards that. But where that couldn't be delivered, we've asked you to demonstrate how you're reprioritising your resources, and in particular to firstly, remote delivery models and extending that to a wider group of students, not just those in target schools and wards, and thinking carefully about people applying next year, early admissions deadline coming up, and people in transition years, year 9, year 11 and year 13. We've also asked partnerships particularly to look at the role of FE colleges in partnerships and the possibility of enhancing work enabling progression between further education and higher education. And the reason for that is we think that more students may well want to study locally at the moment, given the current environment. We know that the intake in FE is high this year, so progression from FE into HE will be really key. We've also encouraged partnerships to use the networks to raise awareness of the new national tutoring programme, which is of course aiming to tackle some of the issues I've highlighted already, the loss of learning for the most disadvantaged students in schools and its implications for the attainment gap. We've made clear that we'll be working with our board and engaging with government in the autumn about the future of UniConnect, given the current phase ends in the summer of next year, and we want your help with that. So we will be drawing on evidence we've got from the programme evaluation, from case studies we already have with you, but please do send us evidence of impact where we have it. We're aiming to publish late next week the latest evaluation report from CFE, which is based on local evaluations conducted by partnerships, and that has some very important findings. It, for example, shows how multi-intervention outreach, like you're all involved with, has a positive and sustained impact on outcomes for the most disadvantaged learners. It shows how light touch individual interventions have much more impact when they're delivered as a series. It shows how younger learners are particularly influenced by people they identify with, people like themselves, and how that challenges their expectations and their conceptions about higher education. And it shows how learners at a later stage of their school and college career, who are particularly close to higher education, particularly need in-depth subject engagement as they get near to that. So that kind of evidence will be important. Also, the evidence we have from earlier evaluations about the efficiency that UniConnect generates, the professionalism of the work, given the focus on evaluation and the sustained basis for it. They will all be important dimensions. We're exploring the full range of options for the future, and we'll need to do that. So that would range from a comprehensive programme like we have now, encompassing outreach hubs as well as targeted outreach for new and existing learners, right through to a more limited engagement with learners already involved in UniConnect. I think that in any scenario, and I'm really clear that in any scenario, we expect the outreach hubs to be central and indeed to become more important, and we're going to want to strengthen that issue I flagged about the role of further education colleges and the importance of progression between further education and higher education. I thought I'd give you 4 key messages that we're using in relation to UniConnect and encourage you to think about how you deploy this in your own areas and in your own context. So firstly, schools, colleges and universities are, as we've talked about, facing immense difficulties due to the pandemic, and UniConnect is in a unique position to work across them to ensure both young and mature students can access higher education and give them the skills they need for the future. Secondly, UniConnect partners between universities and further education colleges and with local agencies and careers advisors and employers, and it provides a single point of contact with schools and colleges to find out about educational opportunities and pathways, and partnerships tailor their focus to local needs, both in age groups and subject focus and activities. Thirdly, UniConnect is impartial. It provides impartial information, advice and guidance, and indeed it provides that on pathways right through further in higher education, so from levels 3 through to 6, and in doing so it focuses not just on academic issues and personal issues but also financial issues. So it's about removing barriers and creating pathways. And then fourthly, UniConnect provides long-term coordinated outreach. It enables schools and colleges to focus their resources on the academic performance of young people, which of course has been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. So it's more important that schools can focus their resources on that this year. Those are 4 important messages for me, and it'd be helpful if you can think about those in your own context. I'm just going to finish by reflecting a little on the debate that we've seen over the last 6 months or so about how many people should go into higher education. And indeed the nature of higher education, which is of course crucial to your work and the future of UniConnect. So to start with, you don't need me to tell you that, you know, forecasts of future skills and future labour markets identify that more and more jobs will rely on higher level skills. So there's a need for young people to develop the attributes they need to succeed in that world, and they will be both specific higher level skills but also the broader cognitive abilities to adapt to change into the future. Although many graduates, or some graduates, don't feel they necessarily chose the right course, and we need to work on that, you'll find very few people regret going into higher education given the friendships, the knowledge and the experience they had when they were there. But we do need to make it easier for students to take different routes through higher education, starting out in FE, for example, taking intermediate qualifications and taking it later in life, you know, at all stages of life. Education, as we know, for example, from the work of the Social Mobility Commission that they published last week, is not in itself on its own a magic bullet for equality of opportunity. It needs to be part of a joined up strategy in the local areas that you'll all be working in. That will be crucial for levelling up in those areas. But for that to succeed, we do need everyone to have the opportunity to develop their skills and their knowledge to the highest possible level, and to be able to benefit from the life-changing experience of higher education, wherever they start from and whichever route they take. That's it from me. Thank you, Gavin. I'm going to hand over to you, and I think you might be fielding some questions, which I hope I'll be able to answer.
Chris, thank you so much. There's enormous amount there for us to think about, and I think that's a fantastic start to the conference. There are a lot of questions that have come in already, so I'm going to try and combine them into sort of areas of topical areas, if you like. One thing I would like to say, just myself as a chair of one of the Uni Connect boards, is I'm really welcome the comments you just made around the refocus, if you like, at this difficult time on other aspects of our work. So, trying to help a wider group of disadvantaged students out of our wards, current wards, etc. Really value that, and particularly focusing on students who are applying for university this year. I think that's a really important area because we know the challenges. My own daughter's doing that this year, and I know the challenges she's facing. So it's a big, very much welcome that's a focus. There are a number of questions around the digital poverty bit which I'd like to pick up on. I was going to pick up on this myself if it hadn't been picked up on. So the first one was a very simple one, and is there a link initially to the survey that you've mentioned? And I know that there will be, but I think perhaps if we can post that, so that we to everybody here, we'll follow that through. But it's here really about has much thought gone into the digital literacy of learners and key stakeholders to be able to access outreach online, and how can UCPs support with this? So I don't know if there's anything there that you might be able to think about with respect to UniConnect.
So I think so we've had discussion with a number of partnerships about the capability of the students you're working with actually to access your work, and I think we were keen to address that where we could, but not duplicate funding that was flowing through to schools, and I know that may not have been perfect. One of the reasons I wanted to flag the review of digital learning and teaching that Michael's doing is because I think it's important that it shouldn't just be about students who are in university now. It needs to extend into all the work that people like you are doing into schools and colleges, and the challenges there may be even greater. So universities said to me over the last few months, when they had to go into lockdown, they were surprised how many students didn't have access to the infrastructure they expected, and how basic some of that was, such as space. So in a way, it revealed inequality that they hadn't even realised was there, and that's about their current students. And of course, universities were able in many ways to help those students by supplying their own, but by using their own resources. But then that's even harder for people who aren't registered with you and are in schools and colleges. So I think it'd be really helpful for people working on outreach who are extending beyond current students into the schools and colleges sphere to flag whether you agree with the definition I gave and how you think that should be addressed. And I suppose an important point of that is what should be the responsibility of schools and colleges and local authorities, and what should be the responsibility of higher education and universities, and indeed the funders and regulators of universities.
Thank you, Chris. Chris, you coming back to me now. Yep, thank you. Thank you for that, Chris. And I think, again, just to encourage everyone on this call to make sure that they access that digital poverty statement and feed in the thoughts, I think, in terms of where we are with that. There are a couple of questions here on the APP, so the Access and Participation Plan. So one of those is it fair to ask universities to meet APP targets that were set at a time when schools and universities were not facing the gross impacts of lockdown? And then a follow-on from that is, are there plans to punish universities that are not meeting their APP targets? And if so, what can we expect?
Okay, well, let me say from the outset that you will never hear me use the word punish. We are not the Office for Punishment, so that we don't see that as part of our statutory role. Of course, the whole point of the cycle I have described, where we will publish guidance in November and ask you to report in the spring, gives time for you all to reflect on and bring to bear your experience of the last year. And as I said in my talk, those will in part be a report on 1920, so what changes you made to the 1920 plans, which were just 1-year plans, and essentially an assessment about reasonable adjustments, or reasonable judgments around all of that. But they will also give you a chance to say, this is the impact of the pandemic on our future plans, and indeed there are elements of work you would have been doing to prepare for that may have had to change given the circumstances in which you're working, and that will itself set up an individualized dialogue with universities and colleges about what happens to that future plan. And I'm expecting there'll be a differential impact. So as I talked about with the UCAS data, we may well actually have made good progress on access this year in many universities because of the nature of the intake. So the discussion there will be about how do we build on that, and how do we get to where we want it to be for the 5 years. In relation to student success measures, it may be more complex because students weren't on campus or on site for large parts of last year, and then you may have different things you need to focus on during the first term just to get students back on track. So that may well be an area in which we have to work closely together. And then of course we know that the jobs market's been strongly affected by the economy has been strongly affected by the pandemic, so there may be different imperatives in relation to supporting progression or indeed supporting adults. So we see that as being an individualised discussion we have with you next year, once you've submitted your reports. And in the meantime, we want to carry on this kind of discussion so we understand at a sector level what's been happening.
Thanks, Chris. There's just a further sort of backup on that one as well. A number of other questions coming in, which I'm pleased to see. But just on that, on the APP and the fact that obviously it was designed at a time when life wasn't as it is now. So it was very much crafted at that point for in-person delivery, high quality engagement, that sort of thing. So a question here about how will the OFS support higher education institutions to realign our APP outreach targets to reflect this new situation? How much flex will you allow, and will there be any changes to reporting?
I mean, I can't quantify the flex. I've described an individual discussion that we'll have with each of you, and of course part of that will be recognising that the way in which you're conducting outreach now and the way in which you're supporting students and indeed delivering your learning and teaching is changing. So we want to have an individualized discussion about all of that, but I can't, give you a figure for the amount of flex there will be. It will be a sensible individual discussion. Sorry, what's the second part of the question, Gavin? I was trying to,
Yeah. So the second part there was about will the reporting mechanisms change at all?
Yeah. So reporting has changed this year. So we paused any what you might call statutory reporting, like enhanced monitoring reporting, and of course the nature of the monitoring report we'll be issuing guidance on in November will be different. It will recognise the situation in which you've been working, and it will open up a forward look on the impact on your plans. I am expecting we will still continue to collect annual reports like we do now on progress impact reports that we're talking about. But as you may have seen, we're going to try and minimise enhanced monitoring reporting, so roll that up into reporting on other things rather than any kind of in-year reporting. And I think that's a proportionate response to the situation we're in at the moment. Yeah,
thanks for that, Chris. And that's very welcome, of course, in terms of anything we can do to reduce the amount of paperwork we're all involved in. So can I move to another one now around the full budget discussion and CSR that we were talking that we were expecting, obviously, just a day or so ago, and obviously we've been reduced to a year. But so given the delay in that Chancellor's full budget, what implications do you think this might have on any envisaged timescales for decisions on future access and participation funding? So both generally and specific in relation to any UniConnect outreach announcements.
So we are pushing on, and we had a board meeting this week where we agreed to do this with the work to enable decisions to be made about the two key strands of access and participation funding. One is UniConnect and the other is the student premium. which is all about support, particularly addressing non-continuation and enabling all students to succeed when they're there. I'm expecting that both will be an important part of our funding into the future, but in both cases we'll be looking at the evidence of the impact and looking to make some changes. And with the student premium, I think actually one of the things we've learned from this year is how important it has been to supporting students in hardship and the most vulnerable students. And what we'll be wanting to do is identify even more forensically the students that need to be supported through that and driving the money through that way. For UniConnect, as I've talked about, I see the outreach hubs being an increasingly important part of the work. We want further education to become a stronger partner and progression to become a stronger element. But the extent to which it's a comprehensive programme or an outreach hub with something built on top of it depends on the amount of resource that is available. And that's a discussion we've got to have with the government and the board. I think that a one-year settlement is generally unhelpful, because we know that staff contracts are linked to UniConnect, and indeed it hinders planning. And what we've been hoping to do is link the timing of UniConnect to the timing of APPs. We wanted a kind of longer running program which enabled collaboration alongside all the things you commit to do as individual providers. There'll be a judgment for the board about how much risk it's able to take on future funding given the uncertainty at the present time, but we will work towards trying to make it as long running as possible.
Chris, thank you for that. One last question here, and this is a little bit more around inequality and closing the attainment gap, really. So you spoke a bit about in your presentation the summer's events highlighting existing educational inequality within schools. So what's the evidence so far that this will be a catalyst for wider DFE focus on the role that inequality earlier in the education system has in closing the access to higher education gaps?
So I think what we're starting to see is better and better evidence about the impact of the pandemic on students on free school meals, for example, which is a crucial focus for the attainment gap, and indeed key parties like the Education Select Committee highlighting that, and indeed government responding to that, for example, through the National Tutoring Programme. So I think it is very strongly on the agenda, and of course it links quite strongly to the government's broader agenda around levelling up across the country. Education is a key part of that. So I think there's good evidence of the impact of the pandemic that shines a light on the issue, and you can see how that is leading to some initial response through the tutoring programme. The question, of course, is how that flows through to other measures into the future. What happens to the pupil premium into the future, and other measures to address the inequality that we see. I guess my message for universities is, and this has been the case since I've been doing this job, is it's really important that all parts of society take steps to reduce inequality earlier in the educational system, but universities can help to support that. So through your in-depth subject knowledge and the kind of work you do with schools and colleges. And I think it's really important that universities make admissions decisions based on the potential of students when they come through, and understand the context in which grades are achieved. That's really crucial in our system, given the level of the attainment gap and the degree to which it's influenced by social background. So I think there's still a very powerful place for contextual admissions in our system, and that will be a case during the coming years.
Chris, thank you ever so much, not just for your presentation, but really thorough and full answers to those questions. And thank you to everyone who submitted the questions as well. I'm afraid we're going to have to move on, but thank you again for joining us today, Chris. Really do appreciate it, and the support that you've not just given to Study Higher, but generally the whole UniConnect programme across the UK. Thank you for that.
Okay, thanks a lot.
let's move. We're going to move on now then to the next keynote speaker, and I'm delighted to introduce for this one Sara Khan. Sara is Vice President at the NUS for Liberation and Equality, and Sara is the Vice President. Has been this now for a little while. Before that, she's served as the Liberation and Access Officer at the University of Manchester Students' Union. This was from 2018 until 2020. So she's a NUS role is fairly recent, and within this role, Sara worked to build the Decolonise University of Manchester campaign, and presently is leading on the NUS's campaign to decolonise education. And she's going to talk to us today a little bit about that. The title of her keynote is Challenging Structural Bias in Education. So Sara, over to you.
Thank you, Gavin, and thank you so much to Study Higher for having me. I'm really proud to be here today representing the National Union of Students. It's always really encouraging and energizing to be in a space like this, to hear when people like yourselves have the passion to create change. So this morning, I want to take the opportunity to delve into some of the issues that we've begun to discuss through Chris's really important keynote. Regarding BAME students in particular, just a little deeper. Amidst the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement and the rise of the far right, both at home and abroad, recently we've been putting a mirror up to our society to really investigate its successes and its flaws. The COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent lockdown has also provided a lot of us as individuals space for introspection, for learning, and for new perspectives. I'm sure many of us suspect that the year 2020 is going to be a prominent feature in history textbooks in the future, because it truly feels that we're standing at the edge of a precipice. The scale of the struggles that we're discussing today, that we're facing, struggles of life and death of a transforming world, of a new normal, it makes coming back to the words BAME awarding gap, words which have been floating around the sector as an area of very justified concern for quite a while now, perhaps feel a little strange. They're certainly not words with the same sense of urgency as pandemic or crisis or lockdown. It might seem like awarding should be the least of our concerns right now, that it has no real impact on the life and death struggles of the world around us. However, while many of us may be more or especially aware of the violence and the death which is surrounding us, it might actually be more important now than ever to talk about such things, to talk about the reasons why this awarding gap exists, to understand it as a form of violence, a manifestation of the historic trauma and inequality that our institutions perpetuate against people of colour. Let's keep in mind that many of our institutions here in the UK were built using the profits of slavery and were the birthplace of eugenics and racist academic theory. So when I speak of institutional violence, it is because racism and every kind of oppression are violent. We're taught that violence is exclusively interpersonal and that this can only be physical, but we know that violence can be psychological, social, political, and economic, overt and covert. Racist microaggressions from fellow students and from staff are forms of violence. They cause psychological damage and incurable trauma to people of colour on a near daily basis. They reaffirm and re-entrench existing inequalities in our society. We need to acknowledge that education also doesn't exist in isolation. It's one strand of an interconnected capitalist system linked to employment, to health, to housing, to being able to pay your rent and your bills and pay for food. In a neoliberal economy, education is not simply about personal development and about creating well-rounded citizens. It is quite literally a matter of life and death. When talking about the symptoms of structural inequalities in our institutions, then, it's important to frame our discussion away from putting the onus of a perceived failure on individuals. Rather, we need to understand that these inequalities are a product of how our institutions are failing their communities. That's why I've been using the language of awarding gaps rather than attainment gaps. In some areas of the sector, we're beginning to speak of moving away from this deficit model, as it's called. When we talk about attainment gaps, we follow this deficit model, which frames the existence of this gap around failures of individual students, something that they lack. And it's the deficit model that frames institutional responses at the moment. If a student is lacking support, provide a mentorship scheme. If a student doesn't have money, give them a bursary. If a student is attacked, give them an anonymous reporting system. Little thought is given to changing the structures that create these issues in the first place. So the language of awarding gaps rather than attainment gaps is a step in beginning to acknowledge that the blame is not on individuals, it's on the institutions. That institutions need to address the inherently violent structures of the organizations. In this context, equality, diversity, and inclusion approaches are failing us. Mainstream conversations on racism are led by these EDI approaches, and they have brought some positive changes, such as increased representation of BAME people in leadership, but representation alone will not bring liberation. Far from it. One BAME person in a leadership position cannot realistically create lasting institutional change, nor should they be expected to. EDI approaches only work to put a plaster on the wound, failing to confront the fact that racism is not a mere paper cut, but multiple organ failure after centuries of being beaten, battered, and bruised. So we need to identify and dismantle the roots of racism. We know that education is built on historical genocide, on the profits of enslavement, through knowledge which was stolen through colonialism. We know that education is built through the displacement and destruction of our communities, through the gentrifying effects of our ever-expanding campuses. The economic, cultural, and social structures in place until the end of the British Empire did not disappear with the creation of the Commonwealth. Up until 2015, UK taxpayers were still paying compensation towards former slave owners. Black people have still not received any form of reparation, of apology, or accountability to address the intergenerational trauma that this violence has inflicted and continues to inflict. Black staff and students have been organizing in Western countries and in the global South for decades, but their challenges of the status quo are often silenced by senior leadership, with their ideas, campaigns, and materials being co-opted or watered down. Institutions give some shallow support and lip service for the issues raised with one hand, and sometimes reprimand, discipline, and even legal action against students on the other. We're rarely stopping to take genuine stock of the reasons why inequalities and gaps exist, the historical roots of those problems, to truly take accountability, to acknowledge and to reflect on the ways in which racism is built into every fiber of our education system, from our governance structures to the lecture room cleaner, from the senior lecturer to the student working full-time to fund their studies. This necessary reflection should not be limited to red brick institutions either. Newer universities are not free of guilt. Our institutions are still complicit in modern colonial violence through economic ties to arms companies, to fascist regimes, and to fossil fuels. Our institutions undermine and disregard students when they report racism, traumatizing them and reaffirming that universities are not built to serve their interests. The business-like expansion of institutions under a marketized system is pricing Black and Asian students out of education and causing the destruction of our communities through gentrification, which has become another modern manifestation of colonialism. Meanwhile, international students of color are often encouraged to come and are welcome to come, not only because they bring profits to institutions, but because they will take British knowledge back with them to their home countries rather than staying, which is arguably a form of cultural colonialism in itself. The pedagogical framework of our education is built on the works of eugenicists and slave owners too. We hear cries from the right-wing press along the lines of, why does it matter if Immanuel Kant or Rudyard Kipling were racist if they produced great work? But seeing academic work as detached from the writer, apolitical and without any social context, simply erases the violence enacted and entrenched through their work. When Immanuel Kant wrote The Freedom for Man, he meant the white man. He certainly didn't mean people who looked like me. His philosophy wasn't designed for people like us, didn't factor us in, simply because he wouldn't have been able to imagine a world where an Asian person could sit in a classroom in which his philosophy would be taught. But that context is ignored and erased, and we're taught the falsehood that visions like his were universal. Perspectives are presented as apolitical, and generational trauma and lived experience are sidelined. In my own studies, I was taught about partition from a neutral perspective, as if it was an academic exercise, as if it didn't happen to real people, as if my grandfather hadn't told me stories of villages on fire and corpses on trains. His knowledge doesn't have a place in the modern higher education institution. His lived experience is just an argument that needs to be balanced by a student who wants to play devil's advocate. He did not survive genocide so that I could pay $9 grand a year to sit in a classroom and hear of the artistic merit of men who described people like him and people like me as grinning, grunting, black-faced servants. But when we speak up about our real concerns and real trauma, we're accused of being unreasonable. We're accused of being too emotional. We're accused of making everything about race. These accusations come from a lack of understanding that for people of color, race and racism permeates everything in our lives. And this is the daily violence of our education that piles up and makes students of color have breakdowns and mental health crises that make us drop out of university. This is what makes students afraid that if they write an anti-racist essay, they'll be marked down. It makes them afraid that speaking up in the classroom will lead to them being blacklisted by the racist prevent legislation. And we're afraid that if we don't succeed in an institution which is violent towards us every day, that wasn't designed for our success, that we'll be told that it's our own fault. The COVID pandemic has only brought structural inequalities to the fore, with working class people of color more likely to be affected, less able to access healthcare, and more likely to die because of the virus. In higher education, we know that people of color are more likely to be from poor socioeconomic backgrounds. We know that they're more likely to have lost jobs that they may have been reliant on during the pandemic. We know that they're more likely to have poor internet connection and to lack the resources needed for online education. In this landscape, when we turn back to targets for institutions to close the BAME awarding gap, we need to ask what these numbers really mean. Will closing the awarding gap end racism in higher education? Or will it become a tick box exercise? Will it provide structural and lasting change to the violence of these institutions, or will it require a handful of students of color to abandon their culture and their communities and to integrate into the institution so that they can succeed? With the current approach, it seems that things are headed this way. An increased number of mentorship schemes and bursaries will help some BAME students, truly, maybe even enough to close the awarding gap, but year on year, the same issues will continue to exist. The focus on BAME excellence and supporting the cream of the crop only works to further inequality within BAME communities. What about those who don't have access to financial, academic, and welfare support? They will be left at the wayside. Only structural approaches will solve structural issues. And if we want to create lasting and meaningful change, we must ensure that instead of using plaster to only appear to address the symptoms, we conduct a full organ transplant and overhaul the sector. Thinking of the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement in this context, and the important conversations around policing, justice, and violence, we can learn some very, very important lessons. When it comes to interpersonal racist violence, universities take a criminal justice style approach in which reporting reflects the carceral state that we live in. That is to say that these systems don't actually provide justice, healing, and care for people of color, and never will. According to the Equality and Human Rights Commission, while 24% of ethnic minority students said that they had experienced racial harassment at university, only 1/3 of these students said that they had reported that to their university. This significant underreporting shows a clear lack of faith in the system, and rightly so, because it's broken and it does not work for students of color. In fact, it's a sign that the system isn't broken, quite the opposite. It's proof that this system was never actually designed for people of color in the first place, and it's working just fine for the purpose that it was designed for. We need to simply believe people when they report racism rather than forcing them through a dehumanizing and re-traumatizing process, which treats them with suspicion. We need to give trauma-focused and person-focused approaches. We need to center their needs rather than focusing on the perpetrator and the question of whether or not to punish them. Most students who face racist violence rarely even want to see the person who harmed them being punished. They usually want that person to understand why what they did was wrong, to learn and to grow from it, and to work never to harm anyone in that way again. They want their immediate safety concerns to be addressed, whether that's moving to a different hall of residence or to different classes. And most of all, they need to be provided with adequate and racially aware welfare and mental health support. This isn't even to mention when staff are the ones who are responsible for said racist violence, and students are afraid that they will lose marks or lose entire degrees for speaking out. They know that there's a chance that they won't be believed, that they'll be victimized and will not be helped. So we need to respond to interpersonal racist violence, not with hardline punitive action, but rather with an approach of transformative and rehabilitative justice. But again, institutions cannot hope to address interpersonal racist violence without taking responsibility for their own structural and institutional racism. Statues of colonists left in positions of prominence and glorification, buildings named after slave owners who enacted violence on the communities that now use them, environments that vilify students for feeling justified pain or anger. All of this is violent. And the marketization of education that perpetuates a cycle of being unable to access education without money, and then being unable to access money without education is violent. It's violent towards disabled students who can't access expensive assistive technology, towards the ones who can't access financial support because the application processes are too costly, towards those who can't get into classrooms or buildings because there's no step-free access, towards the disabled students who can't catch up if they miss a class because there's no lecture capture, or when there is, no image description or no braille text. When it comes to policing, no student of color can hope to feel safe on campus, while the racist prevent agenda continues to exist. When we notice the increased number of security and police on our campuses and in student neighborhoods, the increase of physical barriers to buildings, with entire campuses being electronically surveilled and inaccessible to the public, often despite being located in BAME areas, it's no surprise that students of color, particularly Black and Muslim students, don't feel safe. Policing is an inherently racist violence. To take inspiration from Black Lives Matter, once again, institutions must stop spending money on policing and start investing in accessibility, in mental health care, in community care, and more. Institutions must invest not in policing students, but in supporting and empowering them. Reducing the BAME awarding gap through the path that we're currently on will not change the lived realities of many of these students. What about the students who live at the intersections? What of the disabled students of color who can't access their learning? What about the trans student of color whose mental health is in crisis because they can't access transition-related healthcare, because they won't recognize their name or who they are? As long as a single student struggles to make ends meet, struggles to pay for food or rent, leaves a classroom feeling dehumanized and silenced, is policed and treated with suspicion on campus, as long as a single student faces racist, sexist, ableist or queer-phobic violence in our institutions, we are failing, regardless of what the awarding gap might tell us. So it's time we treated education as a right and not a privilege. It's time that we see the lives of students as inherently valuable rather than measuring their worth on metrics, on productivity, and on wealth. It's time to build a compassionate world and a compassionate education, because there is no less at stake than life and death. I'd like to finish with the words of Sata Shakur, which give me much strength in these times. It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love and support one another. We have nothing to lose but our chains. Thank you.
Sara, thank you so much for that. I don't think there's one person who will have been listening to this who won't have been moved by what you've been saying. So thank you. And the number of comments that I've seen come up already supporting what you've been saying. I mean, you'll see them in time, but they are, I've lost count of the number of people who are saying how much they appreciate what you've been saying and how you've said it. And I think that's what's really important. One thing I think would be helpful, someone has asked, would it be possible to have a copy of the paper to share with colleagues? Because I think that would be, if you are able to share that at all, because the words you've used there and some of the examples you've given are really, really helpful to demonstrate, I think, as you've described, some of the enormous challenges that that the BAME community and others who are disadvantaged are facing, and I think it's really, really helpful for everyone who's on this, who's listening today, but particularly I think for people like myself who's in a senior leadership position to. I think I've understood even more than I thought. I thought I understood a lot of the challenges already. I understand even more now from what you've said, and thank you for doing that. A couple of questions that I think would be helpful. So one maybe just to start with, you may have covered it a little bit in some of the things you said, but what are the first 3 actions you think that universities can take to start tackling institutional racism and discrimination against disadvantaged students? So what are the top 3?
Thank you, Gavin. I'm more than happy to kind of share what I've written if people would find that helpful. 3 actions. It's a good question because as I've kind of I think alluded to, it's the issue is far more complex. But I think that something that I discussed in a bit more detail, which I think is quite pertinent to kind of the immediate effects of racist violence on campus is surrounding these reporting systems. I think that, rightly so, we're increasingly having conversations in the sector about how we tackle racial harassment on campus. And I think that, institutions have been taking steps towards anonymous reporting systems and training up some staff. But the issue is structural in that the current system requires students of color, if they report an instance of racial violence, to provide evidence. Essentially, it's a case of, as criminal justice works, because the imperative is the question of whether or not to punish someone, to prove their guilt and to decide whether or not to punish them, because that's the focus. There's this need to provide evidence. But of course, in an instance of racial harassment, there is rarely hard evidence to provide unless you've recorded someone saying something, or you have like a audio recording or footage. There is almost never hard evidence in those cases. So 9 times out of 10, a student tries to report racism, and because of this process, they simply won't be believed. Because it's a process that requires them to recount a traumatizing experience over and over again, usually with the result that they won't be believed anyway. So really, I think that one of the fundamental issues is that we need to change that approach and move away from that sort of criminalizing approach and that punishment-focused approach to one that's focused on simply believing people when they report racism and providing trauma-focused and person-focused approach to those people. When we understand racism as trauma, then that simply is the appropriate approach. And as I've said, I think that a lot of students in these situations, from my experience as being a student officer as well, rarely even want to see punishment happen in that case. They simply, you know, when they ask to be removed from halls of residence, for example, to be separated, that's a safety concern. They don't want to be in the proximity of that person who hurt them because it could happen again. It's not about punishment for them, it's about safety. So we really need to just completely kind of reframe our approach, I think, towards racial harassment. And I think that that's, I don't know if that counts as one action, but I think that that's probably one of the most immediate concerns. If I thought of two others, then I think none of what I'm about to say is going to be easy, but it is a start. One of the other kind of foci of these conversations is around the curriculum, right? This question of it's sometimes framed as diversifying the curriculum, increasingly framed as decolonizing the curriculum. Certainly, like the NUS is going to be campaigning on this this concept of decolonizing education over the next 2 years. And I think that, you know, as I discussed in my keynote speech, questions of diversifying the curriculum only really go so far, because really it's about the pedagogy of our education. It's about how we, you know, frame kind of the history and the knowledge that we produce in our institutions. So, for example, it's wonderful and a step in the right direction if the curriculum is kind of platforming writers of color. But are we having critical conversations about, you know, racist ideology? For example, I'm a student of English literature, and you know, I think that you could argue that certain authors of color, like take Salman Rushdie, for example, don't necessarily frame things in an anti-racist way. You know, because we live in a racist world, and people of color, as much as anyone else, we're taught that and internalize that ideology. So we're as capable as anyone else of perpetuating it. So really, it's about the pedagogy of our education, and in every single discipline. Though I think that, you know, in some we might be more inclined to think that history and politics is irrelevant than in others. It's always relevant, and all of our disciplines in our entire education system have been founded on racist knowledge, and it's something that still permeates the knowledge that we teach. So I think that it's so deeply important to have this critical kind of race approach to our education, and to have these conversations about decolonizing our pedagogy. And in terms of a final one, I'm having like a scroll through my points and trying to see what might.
Maybe I can pick up on another one.
Oh no, something has come to mind. I think that policing on campus is a really big one, actually, and it's becoming more relevant than ever. Actually, I think it's an increasing concern during this pandemic, because I think that we're seeing a lot of institutions and indeed the government respond to, especially, you know, this week with kind of rising cases of COVID, particularly centered around student halls, etc. The response to that we're already seeing as being like heavily punitive and heavily focused on kind of policing. And we know that policing affects communities of color more than anyone, right? It's an inherently racist violence. So I think that especially now, but just in general, questions of policing in our education are really key. So one of the really tangible ways in which this manifests is through the Prevent agenda, which there's vast evidence to prove that it disproportionately targets Black and Muslim students, even though it's, you know, purportedly like anti-radicalization. This is interpreted and enacted through a racist lens, and this has like very material experiences on students' lives, because you know, most Black and Muslim students that I know, like myself included, are very aware of its existence because it will have impacted us. And kind of within our institutions, kind of lecturers, teachers, and even like counselors have an obligation under the Prevent agenda, which means that a lot of students of color are just simply not able to, or feel safe to actually speak up in the classroom. That's something which obviously contributes to the awarding gap, because if students of color aren't able to like have these intellectual conversations in earnest because the fear of policing, then that's certainly something that contributes to the awarding gap, and it's something that contributes to the mental health crisis too, because if you're afraid that you might be reported to the police by your counsellor, then you certainly aren't going to seek mental health help. So of course, prevent is a legislative measure that institutions have an obligation under, but I think that the certainly institutions have influence to kind of speak up about this and speak to the government about this, because it is one really tangible form in which policing is affecting communities of colour on a campus. So those are my three. I know that wasn't incredibly succinct, but these are unfortunately quite complex issues.
No, and thank you for that. Thank you for that, Sara. I fully appreciate that. We are very much at time, but there is one question I would like to ask, because I think that is really relevant to this conference. And if you could be quite quick in terms of your answer, and I understand it may not be a quick one, but it's about how far you think we should go about talking about race and racism in university with our BAME outreach attendees. So this is come from someone who's faced racism at work. So often there has to be a fine line between encouraging young people to come to university, but also being honest with them about the sort of environment that they might face. So how honest should we be? And you've touched on that a little bit with your previous answer, but
I'm quite of the opinion that we simply just should be fully honest about it, because people of color, we live in a racist society that manifests in kind of every aspect of life, and that includes higher education. I don't think it particularly helps anyone involved to be in denial about that. I think, if anything, many students would very much welcome the kind of accountability and transparency and taking responsibility of being like, we understand, and this is something that we're taking responsibility for. I think that that's actually more encouraging, because a lot of the time I think that something that can be quite disheartening for many students to see or to experience is what feels like the unveiling of a certain kind of hypocrisy within higher education, because I think that many of us, certainly domestic students, are not under the illusion that we don't live in a racist society, and that manifests in education as well. So I think that we should take full responsibility and be completely honest about these issues where possible.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Gavin.
Sara, thank you so much. And again, for, as I said, a real, I think it would have touched everyone, your presentation today. So thank you for that. I also know that your diary is going to be extremely busy, because people are going to be wanting to ask you to come and talk at various universities, etc. Because I've even seen that on the chat. So so don't be surprised if, as a consequence of today, you get various invitations to speak elsewhere. So thank you for that. Again, thank you to both keynote speakers this morning, to Chris and Sara. We've now come to the break before the next session. So can I say thank you to everyone for attending. Please come back at 11:25 when we are talking to one of the sessions that you choose there, one of 4 sessions, and I will see you later on this afternoon for our session with the panels. So thank you again very much, and enjoy your tea and coffee. See you later.